So thank you for inviting me to Queen's to present the first of these African lecture series. It's indeed a very great honor and privilege, especially since I graduated from the university in the early 1980s on the morrow of the Thatcherite Revolution, and then went on to have lively and interesting academic career at a number of universities during these neoliberal times. I do want to emphasize this neoliberal times because it does structure a lot of the kinds of things that I've got involved with, but we can come back to that debate later. I want to thank Professor Mariska Safek and Dr. Brioni Widders for the invitation to this lecture and to participate in the conference that starts tomorrow. It's indeed very welcome that Queen's wants to have such an annual lecture series, and hopefully it will expand to a research group or a unit about and for a continent that, for all its problems, is one of the most exciting places to do research in, for teaching and generally to enjoy the conviviality of a place that I think is set to grow into a dominant force in world affairs. I hope that in this lecture I will show, through my own research, teaching, and activism, that in many respects the issues we in Africa face are the issues that the world will face in times to come, and that the solutions we, in that diverse place called Africa, have come up with should also be reflected on, not just to know the continent more intimately, but also that the expectations of continuing modernity now and into the future are perhaps being shaped in places on the African continent. Further, Ireland, and Belfast in particular, has many associations with South Africa, not least a town with the same name, a similarity in the town halls of Durban and Belfast, but also some of the colonial legacies, including as my colleague and co-supervisor of my PhD, Professor Donald McCracken at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He comes from this part of the world, by the way, has demonstrated a long history of Irish migration to Southern Africa. The ties that bind us are ones of imperial legacies, an unequal but shared heritage, but also of support for the anti-apartheid struggle and other liberation movements, a shared history of negotiated settlements of the troubles that afflicted us, some of which have been already documented by Patrick O'Malley, and the ways in which we currently grapple with the consequences of that modernity in our respective cities and universities. I did notice, as I was browsing through some of the bookshops, a reference to a recent book by Robbie McVeigh and Bill Ralston, which I haven't read fully, but there's references. I have to say, before I proceed any further, that although I've been introduced as the professor and Mafeje Chair at the University of Cape Town, Archie Mafeje was a graduate of the University of Cape Town and Cambridge, and until his recent passing, well, not recent, about 10 years ago, was a major intellectual on the African continent. And so this chair that I held was in his name. I also at this juncture want to pay respects to my parents and parents-in-law, and another family of my very complex kingship group members, especially those that lived in exile here in Belfast, such as Dr. Zorina Desai, and those in London who inspired me throughout their lives with their generous humanity and unfailing commitment. In this presentation, I want to trace my various entanglements and scholarly engagements with the expectations of modernity in Africa, shaped, configured, and expressed in instances such as trade unionism, the continued saliency of chieftaincy, of land reform, political, ethnic, and religious mobilization, migration and xenophobia, and the discordant public culture of post-colonialism, among other issues that plague many post-colonial societies in Africa. These are all further amplified through the ideas of progress, equality, oppression, exploitation, the overlapping use and abuse of cultural difference, racism, terror and bureaucracy, and its resolutions through the institutional forms such as democracy, an ongoing project into the future. I will show the various theoretical and field positions that I took, the various interventions and shifts that I made that tries to grasp the specificity of the local. After all, I'm an anthropologist, or at least trained as one, about state-centric initiatives and the larger historical trends and forces that are profoundly implicated without necessarily determining it. I adopt in this lecture an autobiographical lens on the understanding, as Du Bois points out, my life, if it has any significance, is in part because I live in the historical present, and the future of Africa and the world is entangled alongside it. Although I was, as an undergraduate student, activist and among the oppressed, my real scholarly engagement starts with my studies at Queen's University. The irony given my present status is, of course, not lost on me. At first glance, my listing of research, writing, publications produced over the last 40 years appears scattered and without apparent coherence. There's a ring of veracity. There's always a danger upon reflecting on one's own work, the tendency to highlight the good, ignore the apparent contradictions and controversial, and to smooth everything into a series of consequential steps to the present. While I don't want to trace a teleologic lineage to my research, I do want to be reflexive, but noting that such reflexive practices are strongly situational, a product of a motivated individual researching and writing in a very specific set of times, specific places, and from a particular position of class, race, gender, status, and intellectual history, and political culture. Bearing in mind the combination of the normative status that afflicts intellectuals, what some call these days the privilege of race, class, and education, much of my research writing has been prompted by my overarching theoretical and socio-political concerns, in particular, injustice, inequality, prejudice, by the very real contextual events pre-1994, that's pre our first democratic elections, and the new kinds of research and writing that include engagements with the post-apartheid state and its public culture. Foundational influences were the student politics of the 1970s and 1980s, the debates of Walpole and Morris, of Legassick and Innes, respectively at the universities of Sussex and Warwick, my own training at Queen's University under John Blacking, and a politics lecturer by the name of Mick Cox, who taught me everything about Marxism, as well as my tutors, Joyce Pettigrew and Milan Stuschlik. But serious discussions with my colleague, Enver Matala at the University of Warwick, and then at the Sackett Trust in South Africa, who is now at the Nelson Mandela Metro University, and a meeting with the late Neville Alexandra, one of the foremost public intellectuals in South Africa. If you haven't heard of him, look him up, please. Where the concept of class and organizational democracy was placed at the center of research, of writing, teaching, and activism. All of this was informed by major debates initiated by intellectuals such as Poulantzas and Althusser, but also Weber and Robert Michels on bureaucracy and the limits of organizational democracy. Indeed, in the 1980s, I was identified misleadingly, as I can say for myself, as one of the workerist activists while working and doing ethnographic research amongst the independent, non-racial trade unions. My own family political background in both the Unity and the Congress movements were also major influences, because within these circles, the concept of class was not something foreign. It was, if one cares to read their literature carefully, an indigenous articulation of class and race within a fluid kind of socialist welfarist perspective being debated long before the contemporary debates in the 1970s and the 1980s. In fact, it began certainly in the 1930s, even though the Communist Party had already been in existence in South Africa. The debate in the 1970s and 80s was largely between white liberals, African nationalists, and neo-Marxist radicals. But to note that the kind of industrialization South Africa underwent in the 19th century placed class and proletarianization as indicative of an industrial modernity high up on the agenda in contrast to other African countries. This does not mean that these issues were absent outside of Southern Africa, but their exact configuration as a result of their very specific colonization and post-colonization development gives us a very different kinds of class and occupational hierarchical articulation, as such studies on the copper belt in Zambia have shown, both in the 1930s and 40s and more recently. Indeed, these studies may be reinterpreted, as some have already been in South Africa, through the lens offered by Hart and Negri's concepts of the multitude and the poor. Specific to my research in the 1980s was the concept of worker-led unions, which placed democracy at its center, borrowing from the shop steward movement in Europe, but giving it a twist of worker control, meaning that workers made decisions at factory level, building that into a series of accountable structures up to the highest level of decision-making, where leaders and officials had speaking power only, not decision-making power. The influence of this democratic practice was expressed a decade later upon Mandela's release, when a worker leader said that Mandela had to consult with the workers before making decisions at negotiations with the apartheid state. I mention this because when political democracy arrived, it was not a foreign Eurocentric concept, as some voices today suggest behind the idea of decoloniality. I did not write up much of this ethnography, although I did make a few presentations at anthropology conferences, only to be told very politely by senior anthropologists that was really industrial relations at best and at worst sociology. It was definitely not anthropology. On reflection, though, one of the things we, meaning the independent trade union movement, tried to do, especially with British and American companies, was get them to sign a recognition agreement. A recognition agreement outside the official industrial relations framework that denied collective bargaining rights to black workers. It was not just to recognize that a trade union under common law in apartheid South Africa is the representative of workers in the factory, but also to recognize that workers had a right to have rights, an issue that is now quite central to movements such as the Black Lives Matter and various indigenous peoples' movements globally, and to push back against various right-wing and neo-fascists who claim that their rights are being undermined. This, of course, is a debt to Hannah Arendt, who was avidly read by various socialist and anti-apartheid activists in the 1950s. The traces of that intellectual engagement in Southern Africa still has to be researched and made more widely known. But the experience formed the basis of a couple of articles on trade unions and the Communist Party, as well as a full book-length historical work on non-racialism and trade unions in Durban during the interwar years with my comrades, Paul Titchman and the late Vishnu Padiachi. It also formed the basis with another colleague, Mala Singh, of an infamous or famous critique of the four-nation theory through an analysis of the politics of race, class, and ethnicity of the Natal Indian Congress, the one that was started by Gandhi way back in the late 1890s. But in the 1980s, the Natal Indian Congress was the kind of identity transmission belt into the ANC's version of nationalism and liberation. One quite influential theoretician of the ANC recently identified me at a recent Wits University function, not as the head of Department of Social Science, but as one of the authors of the article written some 30 years ago. Apparently, it was and still is the subject of debate in some circles. I can only assume the longevity because the four-nation theory of South African nation persists, because it is an unreconstructed ideology post-1994, post-apartheid. Thankfully, though, dissent, that widely undervalued ingredient in democracy, especially as principled and informed opposition, still flourishes among university-based intellectuals to research and write what they like. Although I must say, at the presentation of that paper at the university, my colleague and I were mocked, and one famous Congress leader told me I had sold out, by which I think he meant that Indians, as a racial, ethnic, and cultural category of people that had become fossilized into a thing that had to be possessed and managed and owned and be a marker of identity, rather than the cutting edge of progressive thinking, debate, and activism. Indeed, although I did not know it at the time, it touches on some of the work that cultural theorists such as Paul Gilroy, back in the UK, now at UCL, in his insistence on non-racial anti-racism, being very suspicious of race as an ethnic ideology. Suffice to say that in my world, where the idea of race as one of the pillars of the Freedom Charter, the official foundational vision of the present government, is itself generated by an ideology of racism. Gilroy likens this to fascism, which is, to put it mildly, not too far from a strong streak of anti-intellectualism that exists among many African governments that took over the bureaucratic reins of an unreconstructed colonial state. The strong streaks of anti-intellectualism in South Africa was never more present and ominous than when I ventured forth in my first fieldwork research towards understanding the land question. I went specifically to enlist the views of white commercial farmers in the Nkweleni-Melmoth area in northern KwaZulu-Natal, an area that historically was one of Shaka's hunting grounds, but also an area that was given over to World War I soldiers, that conflict of really imperial dimensions. Today, it is a rain-fed and irrigated agricultural area of very high commercial value. Cattle, forestry, sugarcane, as well as export quality citrus fruit, bananas and tomatoes. Some of it, of course, now finding its way into Ukraine, or used to, and Russia. I was told at the time that if I should try to interview any farmer, their farms would be burnt down, and my safety could not be guaranteed. It took almost 6 months before the newly formed government of national unity, through a cabinet minister's intervention, assured the farmers and the local political parties, well, actually they weren't, some of them were national political parties, that there was no threat. I was, to quote the cabinet minister, a naive researcher interested in the new willing buyer, willing seller promulgated land reform measures, and that their farms would not be nationalized. In any event, I went on to research land reform implementation, communal property associations, production units, household livelihoods, and tripartite cooperative forestry reconstruction, sponsored by the then Labour government of Tony Blair, and significantly, traditional authorities. Most of this work was written up as research reports. I now need to have a drink of water. Most of this work was written up as research reports, which eventually, I would like to believe, informed the evolving government policy on land reform and its implementation, at least as informed by the empirical evidence and the attempt to change the nature of paternalistic master-servant relationships on the land to a semblance of democracy. This work also offered myself an insight into how governments work, and perhaps the missed opportunity to probe what the sociologists Erik Olin Wright, Goran Thurborn, and Klaus Oaf, and in South Africa, Dr. Ivan Chipkin, variously called the problem of the internal workings of the state, or policy and governance. I'll leave the funny one for a later stage, where in government I saw people literally moving papers from one end of the desk to the other end of the desk. This was on land reform, which shocked me. Anyway, one of the influential publications at the time for me was one to which Professor Hastings Donnan and Graham McFarland contributed, which was entitled The Anthropology of Policy. My more academic publications from this period concentrated on traditional authorities and the institutionalization of local government democracy in the 17 peri-urban amakosi, or chiefdoms, that surrounded the metropolitan city of Tegwini, with several colleagues, Dr. Sibongiseni Mkhize, Professor Joe Beale, lately of the LSE, Professor Sultan Khan, and Dr. Benoit Lutford. Several quixotic windmills were critiqued, especially the now ingrained and often quoted Mahmoud Mamdani thesis that the rural zones represented anti-modernist and anti-democratic norms, which is a strange conception when at the time there were numerous rural-based civics and NGOs protesting at the 2002 World Sustainable Conference in Johannesburg. Martin Legassic took the position that chiefship is an anachronistic institution, not the bearers of the cultural authority as stated in the Constitution. My colleague, Professor Francis Nyamjo, and I agree that far from being pushed aside by modern power elites or by industrialization, as predicted by modernization or Marxist productivist theories, chiefship had proven to be remarkably resilient to the new evolving post-colonial condition without being too transformed as an institution, where such chiefs were active agents alongside new rulers and old elites, claiming various ethnic and cultural symbols as a way to maximize new opportunities at the center of bureaucratic power, and at the local level, where control over land and labor requires financial and symbolic power. Chieftaincy is still central to ongoing debates on how to develop democracy and accountability by both citizens and subjects all over Africa. My colleague, Professor Ntebeza, has been central at claiming that democracy in the countryside has been compromised in the post-1994 Constitution, the Constitution that is proclaimed worldwide as one of the best in the world. His research shows at the local level that chiefs had been accountable in terms of constitutional democracy, and it was not an alien concept. It is historically formed part of rural government for the last 200 years, even as the colonial, apartheid, and post-apartheid states prefer static conceptions of subject and citizen, or primitive governments and modern polis that serves contemporary state-led projects. In short, this kind of hidden history is often ignored, yet is vitally important to the whole modern democratic project. 2 conferences at the University of Cape Town and a planned third one on the conceptual binary rural-urban testifies to what is at stake. The reality away from the ivory towers is always so much more complicated, and in many instances, traditional leaders and their courts represented legitimate continuities of historical and cultural authority, often the only forms of contemporaneous official and unofficial governance structures, while new post-1994 local government still struggles to institutionally embed itself in the lives of the rural poor. In many ways, the 2 Maxes, Weber and Gluckman, rather than Mark or Legassic, were more helpful in trying to understand the traditional authorities as a combination of charismatic, rational bureaucratic, and legitimate leaderships, entangled in a very modernist project of the emerging black rural elites deep interest in commercial farming, in rural trading stores, shares in national retail chains like Spar, tourism ventures, game parks, and very transparent attempts to secure resources as the gatekeepers to global capital's reach into forestry plantations for the manufacture of paper and wood. Gourmet mushrooms for markets in Europe and Asia, mining, everything from anthracite to titanium, and more recently, fracking for gas. They just have not yet been able to reach onto the ocean floor. Much more research on this topic, especially over who benefits from these arrangements, is needed, and needs to move away from emphasizing preconceived notions of ethnic identity, normative structures, invented history, and mistaken essentialisms. By now, in the 2000s, any allegiance I had to Enlightenment universals had all but vanished. South Africa is, or was, and still is a highly monetized, unequal capitalist economy and society, and indeed was so from the beginning of the 20th century. Mining, being an extractive economy, has been formative in shaping industrial South Africa. And one of those crucial institutions to its success, not inflows of capital, but was internal and transnational migration, both historically, going even back to pre-colonial times, and in the contemporary. While I'd always known this to be the case, being of that class of people that employed servants, usually internal migrants, or their now urban settled descendants, the issue began to reoccupy my mind, but it sped off in another direction. I had already explored migration in the context of trade unions. This new wave of migrants coincided with what was sometimes called the new wave of migration to South Africa in the 1990s and the very visible and intense global transnational migration in the 2000s. To wit, I began fieldwork in the center of Durban among Senegalese, Congolese, Malawians, to a lesser extent Cameroonians, Somali, and Kenyans. Indeed, African migrants don't always want to come to Europe or to the UK. In very incipient ways, the Chinese were there also. And then suddenly, they were the wholesalers to the informal traders and owned the ubiquitous China malls. The Chinese connection still needs to be told. It's an absence in my research because of my very Afrocentric focus at the time. In terms of my eventual fieldwork, I concentrated on the Senegalese as global traders. In fact, when I visited New York, I bumped into somebody I had interviewed earlier. He was now trading, where was it? At the ferry just before you take to go to Staten Island. I'm not sure exactly. I was more concerned that he knew who I was in the middle of New York. I eventually wrote a thesis on Malawians, but compared in various papers both the Senegalese and Malawian migration strategies. The context of the fieldwork was very important and very interesting. The Durban Metro Municipal Council at the time, or eThekwini as it is now known, was the only one in the whole of South Africa to acknowledge migrant informal trading as a significant contributor to the local economy. It gave legal recognition only to those with South African identity number holders, which meant that you could have, if you were a foreign migrant, a South African identity number. And for those of you that are doing this kind of research, you will know exactly what that means, because a lot of people have to do this without numbers, without identities, and sometimes have to hide their identities. I was, of course, very interested in the way that foreign migrant traders were able to get around the rules and the regulations. What is informal is, of course, a very heated debate since Keith Hart first coined the term way back in the early 1970s. I did attempt to research this particular topic in the early 2000s, but did not get very far. The research on migrants raised a slew of issues for me, trying to come to grips with what I perceive as a rapidly changing social situation, away from the dominant national discourse and ideational model of race, reconstruction, and transformation. In my scientific expeditions to various African countries, as my French colleagues call these field trips, in Abidjan, Yaoundé, Bamenda, Nairobi, Mombasa, flows of people, places, and events is much less one- or two-dimensional and more complex than I had hitherto thought. The push-pull model was an easy entry point, but was at best only a partial insight into this global phenomena that entailed global networks versus local networks. The Senegalese are an example of this. Long-term migratory routes versus newly emergent ones. The Malawians are an example of long-term migratory to South Africa, starting way back in the late 19th century with the discovery of gold and diamonds. Refugees and exiles versus economic migrants. And we can go into a whole story about who were the refugees and exiles in South Africa that came from Europe. Alterity and mimesis, of course, making space for cosmopolitanism and xenophobia and autochthonous belonging. Religion was beginning to look like a material tool of group and status identification. There were flows of capital, of trade networks, and transnational and internal migration, which is all informal. Migrant household structures and livelihood strategies were very important. And of course, all these which led to the process of urbanization and the expansion of the boundaries of the cities. Now, least anybody criticizes me for resurrecting structural binaries such as on the lens of migration, let me say that many of my informants' conversations, including their normative representations of themselves, is in binary ethnic or nationalistic comparisons. Violent Zulus versus placid Indians, hardworking Senegalese versus crafty Somalis or Nigerians, and so on. In their actual practices, in their everyday strategic networking and tactical moves around the city, making a living, these notions of themselves and others would often disappear, recede, they would invent new ones, and the old ones would reappear as the situation demands. This is, of course, not unusual, as anyone knows, or working with them, and particularly theoretically, as I learned from Milan Stušlik's work on distinguishing between normative representational folk models and actual and analytical models. There is, of course, a further implication today that I want to mention. The response of Europe to the refugees from Africa and Syria is completely different to those refugees from Ukraine. Othering as injustice and inequality and xenophobia, and the struggle for the possibility of a cosmopolitan humanness are not particularly the purview of anthropology or of African studies only. Writers as diverse as Keith Hart, Achille Mbembe, Dipesh Chakrabarti, Paul Gilroy, among others, at different times over the last 2 decades, have argued for forms of shared yet differentiated cosmopolitanism. It is manifest in both Europe and Africa, even though it manifests in different forms. It is, of course, quite important here not to emphasize differences for the sake of comparative relative suffering and victimhood. This is what global newsworks are good at. After a while, I got tired of watching CNN and the BBC and a whole host of global news networks on the Ukrainian crisis. And of course, social media. We have to study such situations as comparative cosmopolitanism to understand how modernity operates in an increasingly troubled, unequaled world, riddled with injustices, that stretch at least from the initial voyages of exploration and the subsequent colonialism, and now coloniality. And is it within coloniality that we need to understand where modernity is going to go? As you can guess, I don't have any truck with postmodernity. The idea of comparative study and cosmopolitanism took on a new and urgent meaning when the Rhodes Must Fall and the Fees Must Fall movements gained prominence between 2014 and 2019. I was both at Wits University and at University of Cape Town when this happened. In a context that demanded decolonization, particularly of the curriculum, the study of Africa by Africans, in which I include myself, despite my lineage spreading itself both before and during the centuries of colonial expansion, with one young branch in Wales and the other, much more longer lines of descent spread over Asia and the Indian Ocean. In this context, I became part of a research project known as the Afro-Asia Project, with its empirical intent looking at musical migrations that spread over a vast scale from Indonesia to southern Spain, from the southern tip of Africa over the Middle East, down many tributaries going east and west, between 700 CE and 1800. We're still in the process of assessing this 7-year project, but I want to share some of the epistemic assumptions. Until recently, the decolonial project was largely just a critique of westernization. We took our cue from Fanon and Ngugi wa Thiong'o and the philosophers Pauline Hotunji and Achille Mbembe. Ngugi poses the questions: what should we do with the inherited colonial education system and the consciousness it necessarily inculcates in the African mind? What directions should an education system take in an African wanting to break with neocolonialism? Afrocentric or Eurocentric? What are the materials they are exposed to, and in what order and perspective? Who should be interpreting them? An African, a non-African? If African, what kind of Africa? One who internalizes a colonial world, or one who attempts to break with the inherited slave consciousness? Ngugi did not reject Africa's place in the world in which we engage as Africans. What he proposed was a recentering of Africa. A rejection of the assumption that the aspiration to modernity is to accept Eurocentric notions of how we know ourselves and what knowledge we produce of ourselves. The philosopher Hotunji echoes this view, but is careful to state that while we must distinguish between the knowledge produced by Africans or by Africa or on Africa by outsiders from that which is produced by Africans, he was well aware that there is no unanimity about what is Africa or a single notion of Africanness amongst those who live in Africa, and that outside influences are strong and influential in our everyday lives, as opposed to the representational model of what does it mean to be an African or have knowledge produced by Africans. However, Ngugi, despite his perceptive understanding of the issues, claimed that language was the absolute key to the way Africa can represent itself, or Africans represent themselves, and to others, where language shapes knowledge in a particular local culture, and therefore also influences what we know and how we know of the world around us. Is this not the old Sapir-Whorf hypothesis? The problem being posed was how to deal with two foundational assumptions that have shaped African intellectual thinking in the 20th and 21st centuries: that language is representational of the world, and the world can be represented in a fixed and measured way. The last aspect becomes important to my other project on modernity and heritage, where material objects can be acted upon by an external agent and therefore change the world in their image and by implication, be the masters of the universe. But more of this shortly. The Afro-Asia Project was consciously about recentering Africa and Asia, and particularly the Indian Ocean. Its littorals and its hinterlands are crucial to many of those projects that we undertook. In some ways, it departed from a simple Afro- or Asia-centric perspective, as it took overlapping influences of polities and their peoples as a starting point. It was part of a multi-university, multi-year, Mellon-funded project that challenges the meta-theoretical level, the idea that globalization originated and centered in the North from the time of the Italian Renaissance. Rather, it traced musical migrations across the Indian Ocean and sought out the large influences of Islam, Judaism, and Hinduism, and Christianity in Ethiopia, and Buddhism, on the various musics in Indian and African entrepôts, and then traces some of these influences through Arab contacts across North Africa to Spain. It sought out Al-Farabi's theory of music, but it's not been translated fully into English. That became a problem. But it saw that as among the first philosophical treatises on music and the importance of that in the lives of the people, those traveling on dhows across the Indian Ocean, and to the various courts, the various polities, rather than say O'Donnell, or if I dare say, John Blacking, although I think they might have benefited more from John Blacking. Afro-Asia sought to undermine the binaries of a singular tradition, modern binary. It sought to undermine those ontologies that produce polis, non-polis, or in anthropological terms, state and statelessness, or nation and non-nation. Yet this flow of the mixture of people going places, engaging, exchanging, and trading rekindled my interest in heritage, specifically museums, an institution at once conservative and dangerous, potentially shattering of myths of recent past times. I was directly influenced by my wife, partner and co-conspirator, Ruxana Omar, the current CEO of the National Flagship Museums, IZICO, in Cape Town, who as a young historian working at the local history museums of Durban, erected in its gardens an exhibition on shack dwellers. The power of the state and its reciprocal counter-arguments sparked my interest. Museums, as Apudurai once remarked, are good to think with. While many local historians, anthropologists, and others in the post-1994 South Africa rush to think of public museums in representational terms, and new museums such as District 6 as the bulwark against the post-apartheid's optical vision of a rainbow nation, I was more interested in the contestation within state-funded museums as purveyor of public goods and services, and simultaneously the sites of learning, research, and undermining of bounded ethnicities and race, and asked the question, what is the modern heritage of Africa? Museums potentially are institutions of public culture as much as schools and universities are, and are sites to engage and confront audiences, the processes of alterity and mimesis, but also the perils of belonging and the powers to impose and construct through the gaze of the official heritage. It was against this background that I joined a discussion that led to the formation of the Modern Heritages of Africa Research Group, or simply MOHA. You can look it up on our website. The MOHA initiative was conceived at a very critical conjuncture. Globally, a resurgence of racism, particularly in the last decade or so, made worse by rising ethnic tensions, rabid nationalism, and increasing global inequality against the nexus of our existential planetary conditions, made worse by climate change. We as humans arrive at this point of the Anthropocene as the consequences of modernity, which paradoxically can only be sustained by the continued pursuit of inequitable and and unsustainable practices. It is within this context that Moha sought to reframe and reconceptualize the legacies of the past and to acknowledge the inequitable ways this past has been researched and recorded, and consequently valorized and protected as heritage. It's our belief that truly sustainable future can only be achieved through a reevaluation and reconciliation of this past as critical heritage. Modern heritage is disproportionately concentrated in Europe and North America, and interpreted through the conceptualizations derived from these regions, while the legacies of other parts of the world, especially Africa, are undervalued, underrepresented, and overlooked. Now, the historical reasons for this inequitable recognition of the recent past are very complex, but they have significant consequences in the present and cannot be disassociated from the colonial and imperial experiences dating back at least to the 15th century, when Africa started to attract the unwanted attentions of early European colonists. Modern heritage of Africa is particularly well-focused lens through which to observe inequities and inequalities of the recent past. A modern age constructed by and for a dominant minority to the detriment of others. In focusing on modern heritage, Moha goes beyond the question of underrepresentation on the heritage registers globally and seeks instead to explore and expose other more critical reasons for this underrepresentation based on historical, racial, disciplinary, and geocultural prejudices that have inherently linked modernity and its associated notions of development progress derived from the European Enlightenment. Rather than being subjected to a singular modernity defined and constructed by the West, Moha contends that Africa's experience of plural and multiple modernities, as I explained through the Afro-Asia Project, and through a confluence of both positive and negative, colonial and post-colonial, tangible and intangible, urban and rural, cultural and natural, that are simultaneously of the local and the global. Intellectually, the work of Moha challenges three broad assumptions that have dominated global discourse throughout the 20th century and were predicated on the experiences and consequences of colonialism. The first is the assumption that the path to modernity was prepared by Europe and North American cultures and countries. Apart from this being an originating myth, there's also an underlying linear conception that progress predetermines a movement from tradition to modernity, which in turn upholds other binary constructs, whether deliberate or not, has successfully advantaged the West at the expense of others. Rural, urban, black, white, developing, developed, civilized, uncivilized, third world, first world, and so on. These are common binaries that we use all the time. In South Africa, there's a literature that speaks of school people and red people, meaning that modern people, the school people, value modern knowledge, and the red people are those who stick to tradition. It's, of course, a ludicrous binary. But many will argue that such binary conceptions at a global geopolitical level remain very central to the institutional work, practices, and structures of global organizations, including UNESCO and the World Heritage Center and ICOM. I've been in their workshops recently with regard to Ukraine. It is shocking. Despite their efforts to redress the past practices and champion an equitable future. Another assumption rests on the idea that because the West is held up as the mirror of progress, the rest of the world, all they have to do is to mimic this and enjoy the fruits of modernity through a top-down exercise against the grain of democratic impulses. The third assumption was that non-European or non-Western nations possess no history, no culture. Nothing in them presupposes progress. The spirit of history, as Hegel talked about. Their histories were stagnant, detached from evolutionary inevitably of Western progress, and needed to be transcended and removed from the frame of modernity. Western scholars, of course, constructed all manner of models, theories, and concepts to assert and reinforce such an assumption. One of the central tasks of MOHA is the construction of new knowledge that is instructive and transformative in framing modernities and modern heritage, not only within Africa, but globally, away from the debilitating Eurocentric assumptions. This has been and still is my framework and theoretical concerns thematically linked through a concern with strategies around race, class, ethnicity, diversity, and difference on intellectual, moral, and political grounds, and in large measure and more general terms, and perhaps unfashionably, the transitions to understanding what was once multiple modernities to contemporary industrial fossil-fueled modernities. These do not exhaust all the concerns of the Africans themselves and of others who are interested in the continent in all its diversity and similarity. Issues of environmental degradation. I just read about Brazilian companies stripping the land in northern Mozambique. Rising sea levels and climate change in an unequal world. This is a big concern of the islands on the east coast of Africa. Continuing and rising levels of poverty and unemployment. In South Africa, we had something like 35% of unemployment among the youth. In any other country, this would have brought down governments. Gender and child violence, these are pretty universal. I've seen the posters all over. I even see it as part of your elections now. The role of the BRICS, especially China, Russia, India, and Brazil. These are the 4 countries, together with South Africa, of course, that abstained from voting on Ukraine. The African Union's attempt to build a Euro-style common market, health issues, particularly now in the ever-present threat of pandemics, urbanization. We will be more than 50% of all people in Africa will be urbanized very soon. The role of multimedia giants and the control of the media as part of democratic public participation. The complexity of state and governance, particularly post-colonial transitional issues. Personally, as I end my presentation, my next project will be to look at the transitional period from 1994 to 2002 through the lens of the politics of sport, policy, and non-racialism. This draws inspiration from my father, who with others were leaders in isolating apartheid sport internationally and formed a massive internal sporting liberation organization from the urban areas to the rural areas. The very non-racial South African Council of Sport, which died, as well as his practice of a very pro-poor humanist medicine. Both activities which have also inspired my children. One who crafts bespoke surfboards for the international market and is a leader in making the sport less racially privileged. And the other, a medical practitioner in the South African public service. Thank you for listening to me. And thank you once again for inviting me.